are going to jump into it. Just for a quick introduction for Steve. Steve is the owner and operator of Ergo Architecture, 28 plus years now with his firm. He's got a tremendous amount of wealth and knowledge locally, and is really working on a lot of different projects for clients, whether it's ADUs, also local developers for complete communities. There's been a few we've worked on. So looking at projects of 20, 30, 40 units plus. So he's got a really good palette of different types of projects that all fit into this conversation of all the changes we've recently seen. So Steve, thanks so much for joining us on the call, and we're glad we're getting into an annual queue on this, because this is really important for owners, especially that own multiple properties here, and how that might impact them positively, negatively. So without further ado, Steve, I'll kick it to you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot, Nick. Yeah, last time we spoke, it was right after the first bunch of ordinances had been passed, and we were focused on ADUs because the city of San Diego had suddenly gone from resisting them to embracing them wholeheartedly, and in many cases far exceeding the state mandates with respect to what you were required to allow. And in fact, San Diego allows multifamily ADUs and bonus ADUs for affordable housing, and they've done all kinds of innovative things that have led us kind of surpass what the rest of the state's been able to do with respect to ADUs. So that got a ton of attention a little over a year ago when it was passed. And maybe I should back up and cover our agenda quickly. So we're going to run through the ADUs. We're going to try to not go into as much depth as we did a year ago, because as you'll learn shortly, nothing has quite changed yet. So all that is still in effect, and it looks like it's mostly going to remain in effect. But what we will touch on is some of the new things, which are SB 9, SB 10, the micro unit bonus, which was also passed originally, and then the complete communities ordinance, which was passed at the time, but due to interpretations, nobody paid much attention to it initially. And now it's kind of the new shiny object. So we'll cover that in a little bit of detail, and then share some resources and open up the floor for questions. But if you have questions along the way, feel free to just shout them out, and we'll cover them as they come.
And one important note I just wanted to add in is that it's fascinating that SB 9, SB 10 have gotten the amount of publicity and people's eyeballs, yet complete communities locally here is something that is going to have a much more profound impact on our housing infrastructure. Yet I don't think many people are talking about it. So this is a point I wanted to raise I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think it's going to become really apparent how right that is in the next year or two. These are our warnings. This is City of San Diego only. It doesn't even apply to the county, and much less other communities. And these are largely my opinions, and I make mistakes, so verify everything with the city. And I guess with that, let's jump into it.
And last thing I will say is Steve's a humble guy, yet if you have a question or a specific situation that's outside the city of San Diego, Steve has knowledge on other incorporated areas. He's doing projects as far as Carlsbad. So a lot of this stuff will be very close in manner as far as the provisions and stuff, yet there'll be different subtleties. So it'll still be a good base level to understand how these things work. And so you can ask better questions and approach the city if you're not in the city of San Diego.
Yeah, that's true. Everything is generally applicable to other communities except for complete communities, which is kind of uniquely city of San Diego. Okay, so we're going to talk about ADUs very quickly at first. I started talking about that initially. San Diego's passed some great ADU ordinances, or terrible depending on your perspective, but it does allow homeowners to add now up to two legally rentable units. One, which is called an ADU, can be up to 1,200 square feet if you have the room for it. And then a second one, known as a junior ADU, can be up to 500 square feet, also if you have the room for it. And it's important to note that both the ADU and the JADU have to exist under your allowable floor area ratio of the zone. And there is one exception. If you're already maxed out on your FAR, you're allowed to build an 800 square foot ADU in addition. But if you're not maxed out yet, you have to stay within your allowable. So that the advantages of ADUs are first and foremost density. You can change your one unit into three, and then parking. In many cases, you're not required to park the units, which has been kind of the showstopper until the new ordinance. And then importantly, you get exemptions from setbacks. And interior side and rear setbacks, you can build right up to the property line now. And we heard that was going to change for multi-story ADUs, but as of today, that's still the law. You get development fee reductions. You theoretically get expedited permitting, but there are so many people in line that it's laughable. And then also you can use pre-approved plans that the city accepts not only our plans, but county plans. Escondido's got a plan set out, so they'll pretty much accept any pre-approved plans from a California building department.
Before we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to remind everyone, if you have a question, there's an option for you on the toolbar to raise your hand, or if you go on the toolbar, there's a chat box. So you can put your question in there and we can make sure that we answer these questions. We want to make it an interactive process, not just Steve dropping all kinds of knowledge and information on us. Okay. All right, Steve, back to you.
Okay, so disadvantages, you can read the slide, but you can't, the biggest one is that you can't sell it separately from the primary unit. And then, you're a little bit size restricted, but typically that's 1,200 square feet's a lot of square feet, and that's not usually a real world restriction. One concern is you can't condo map later, probably. So if that's why you're doing it, I would probably not do it. The ordinance still is not affecting the coastal zone almost a year and a half later, and you do have to conform to all of the building codes that you typically would.
Real quick, Steve, Jay's had a question of explaining more on the pre-planned plans.
Oh yeah, pre-approved, yeah. So what that is there are a number of plans designed by various entities that the city has already taken through plan check. So that is basically your structural plan check. And you still have to go through a plan check process, but getting through the structural component is a big one. That's what your architect is going to spend the most time on. So having that done for you will save a significant amount of money. And I would quantify that as probably about $5,000-ish in time and effort. So it's a pretty handy thing, but it doesn't completely alleviate you of having to go through the plan check process. And it really doesn't save you too much time because it's the same process either way. Perfect. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, we'll make sure to follow up with Jay as well. Cindy mentioned vacation rental limitations.
Yes.
Before that gets addressed, one thing I wanted to point out is one of the preconceived notions about ADUs is that you have to own or occupy one of them. I know that's been many years ago, but I still get that question. So I just wanted to make sure people understand that there's no longer a provision that requires you to own or occupy a property in order to have an ADU.
That's correct. And oddly, the provision does hang around for the JADU. So it's a very strange hair to split, but that's the way they've done it. But yeah, Nick, you're correct. You don't need to owner occupy anymore. And
So I'm
it
glad
is
you brought up junior ADU because my question would be, and I'm sure a lot of people have this question, why would one choose to construct a junior ADU versus an ADU?
well, almost always it's because it's the third unit on the property, and that's your only means to a third unit.
Gotcha. So they've built an ADU, and the only way they can get a second one on there is if they incorporate the junior ADU provisions.
Correct, and that was true for a long time. But in the new code, there's all kinds of other mechanisms, and I guess I'll direct the viewers to our previous webinar where we went into a lot of those details. But now, if you provide affordable, you can build bonus ADUs, and there are other pathways that you can get additional ADUs on there. But yeah, JADU is the simplest, cheapest path.
Perfect. And the last question to Cindy, I want to make sure I get to you. She asked about vacation rental limitations.
Yes, you can't rent for less than 30 days in a ADU or JADU, or the primary residence for that matter. So,
And also, side note, wanted to make sure everyone's aware of the upcoming vacation rental provisions they'll be putting into place, likely in the fall or the beginning of next year. So, meaning they're going to cap the number of vacation rentals we can have in the city. So that's going to be another thing because you're going to have a license. So, all right.
Okay, so anyhow, one of the reasons when Nick and I were planning this that we thought it was such a great idea is because the city of San Diego has been putting together their housing action package for about almost the last year. And we expected it to be adopted by the time this webinar came up and we could discuss all the recent changes. And in fact, it was adopted in February, but they have not posted the changes yet to the municipal code, which has us kind of stuck in no man's land a little bit. But the city was originally proposing that they were going to institute 4-foot setbacks for multi-story ADUs and force developers to comply with tree regulations and reinstate development impact fees for multiple ADUs. And that was right up until the last minute. That was still in the draft ordinance, but it appears that those provisions were not actually passed. As I mentioned, they haven't updated the actual municipal code itself, but they do have an information bulletin on ADUs, and that was updated about a week ago, and it didn't include any of those new provisions that are highlighted in yellow. So it's unclear whether City Council just said, no, we're not doing that, or what the status actually is. But unfortunately, we're going to have to wait until the municipal code is published to see what happens, because I didn't tune in on the council meeting to actually witness the vote.
And so one thing I wanted to mention too is we will make certain that we send you guys a email with the changes when they're formally presented and published. So if nothing else, you know exactly what took place. The other thing I wanted to mention too is as Steve and I talked about this and looking at some of the proposed changes, really it doesn't, I mean, the biggest impact is going to be the 4-foot setback for multi-story ADUs based on people that are landlocked or confined to certain orientation or available land still on their lot. The other ones are really minute points. I mean, hey, great, we have to plant trees for an ADU. I love that, right? But that's not going to prevent or prohibit anyone from moving forward, nor is what we talked about, Steve, the increase in development impact fees. I think the additional fee would be, I think, what did we say, 5,000 roughly?
Something like that, yeah.
Which, if you're building an ADU, is not going to, in most cases, make you decide not to do it because of that. It's still, ADUs right now in this market are a phenomenal value relative to where prices are for any other single family home in the area.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And it's even actually worse than the highlighted thing. It's not all development impact fees. It was only the transportation portion that they were going to reinstate. So it was only about half of the total fee, which, as Nick says, is $5,000 or $6,000 typically. So yeah, it's not going to break your project. Yeah, and this was the actual change that came through. You can see the regional transportation fee, the RTIP, as they often call it, is it was added if you're proposing more than one ADU. So that was the only change that seems to have actually been written into law, as near as we can tell from what's been published.
So yeah, if you own a property, let's say you own a single family or a multifamily, and you're looking to construct at one ADU, as of this moment, there's no additional changes or provisions that owners should be aware of to take into consideration.
I'm sorry?
I was saying if someone on here is just looking to add one ADU, then really this change is not having any impact on, right, this type of homeowner.
No, none to an actual homeowner that's hoping to develop an ADU, and really that wasn't the intent. A lot of the backlash against the ordinance was against developers. So as part of the housing action package, they were really trying to rein in developers, not homeowners who were building an ADU and junior ADU on their properties.
Perfect. Thanks for clarifying. All right, well, let's lead on to SB 9.
Okay, SB 9, one of my favorite topics. We get calls about this all the time because I'm sure you all have received postcards similar to the one on the screen about don't let your neighborhood become 4 mansions crammed onto one tiny parcel. And unfortunately, this is just so far off pace that it's almost laughable. I don't know if the people who wrote these believed what they were doing, or they were just lobbyists that were paid to scare people or whatever. But it really is not. What's depicted isn't allowable, and it just isn't going to go that way. And so one thing I want to point out is that right now SB 9 is a state mandate, and the cities are required to adopt it, but until they do, it really isn't relevant to that particular city. And again, SB 9 was supposed to be part of the housing action package, but the city acted like they were going to adopt it, but again, it doesn't show up in the municipal code yet, so we'll have to wait and see what they did adopt. But what I want to touch on is that it probably doesn't matter for most people, particularly individual homeowners, because the Turner Center at Berkeley did a lot of study of SB 9 and its likely impacts. And as the previous slide showed, some people used it to say this could generate 700,000 new homes in California. But if you actually read the report, it says quite the opposite. Like, for example, in San Diego, there are 203,000 lots that are eligible for SB 9, that are essentially single-family parcels. However, almost a third of those get eliminated because either they're in a high fire severity zone or other zones that don't, historical area, et cetera. There's a bunch of excluded zones. So that eliminates a third of them. And then a whole bunch more are eliminated simply because it's not going to be practical in the real world. And in San Diego, typically that's because the existing home sits more than halfway through the depth of the property. And so SB 9 says that when you divide your lot, you have to divide it no worse than 60-40. And usually there's no 40% of your lot that doesn't have your home sitting on it in San Diego. So that makes it very, very difficult for most people to take advantage of that. And then there's access provisions and other things that make it very hard to split your lot front and back. So the Berkeley study estimated that only 7,000 of the 200,000 lots could actually use SB 9 in the real world. And of those, only 3,000 could get more than one additional unit in. And that's relevant because if you're only going to add one unit, the ADU ordinance is a much better path to adding that unit than SB 9 is. So typically people of those 3,000, most people are going to choose the ADU path. So I think even when it is added to the municipal code, it's going to have very little impact.
Yeah, and that's one thing I wanted to touch on, Steve, is that as we've talked about, there's a lot of levers being pulled on paper from the city, from the state, and yet when you start to dig through the information, what you find out is that a lot of it is not actually realistic or logical for what someone would do, whether it's capital constraints. If someone has a single family home here and they want to stay here, well, in this market, they're going to have a hard time selling and then buying just something comparable. And also homeowners aren't developers. So really the amount of people that this would actually apply to that would actually take action on this is such a small amount that it's really not as big of a talking point as it's been. And we'll defer to that based on the complete communities, right? Which is a much bigger impact, yet it's not really getting nearly the amount of coverage or conversation as the SB 9 and SB 10 have.
That's exactly right. And I think, I think as we look back at this in 10 years or 5 years even, people will not even remember that SB 9 existed. And same with SB 10 as we're about to get to, but even more so with SB 10, because it may never be adopted by cities in the first place. So SB 9 was a state mandate, but SB 10 was just essentially the state saying, okay, cities, we're going to let you pass this type of regulation should you choose. And to my knowledge, there's no community in California that has actually adopted an SB 10 like ordinance under that state provision, and which is true of San Diego. The mayor has suggested that they intend to pass an ordinance under SB 10, but it was not considered as part of the recent housing action package. So that means it's probably not on the horizon in the near future. So I think effectively, if you're thinking today of doing something with your land, SB 10 is probably not something I would even consider at this point.
Awesome. Well, is there anyone, before we head into complete communities, does anyone have any questions about what we've covered so far with either ADUs, junior ADUs, or SB 9 or 10? I want to make sure to give everyone an opportunity. Steve. All right, Steve.
Are we going to discuss micro ADUs?
Micro ADUs. I wasn't planning on it. Did you have anything specific you wanted to ask?
No, I just no, not right now. Thanks. I'm just thinking, should I do micro ADUs? Is there a demand for it? And can people live in 200 square feet?
This is perfect, Steve. This is perfect because complete communities, we're going to dive into this.
It's a wonderful question. And I actually wrote my master's thesis on small spaces, and I designed and built a 64 square foot home. So to me, 200 square feet is lavish, way more space than you need to live in. But seriously, as Nick mentioned, I'm a big proponent of small spaces, and I think if they're well designed, it can really help solve some of our housing problems. And so anyhow, also as Nick mentioned earlier, complete communities is really the piece of code that San Diego's adopted that is going to have a tremendous impact for better and for worse on the city. This slide we're looking at shows that the revolution is here. This building is almost complete now on Fifth Avenue, and it is 100 units, no parking spaces. And I was able to walk through it a week or two ago, and they're pretty darn nice units. And really, this is what's on the horizon. So I know for a lot of you people are thinking, well, that building's too big for my neighborhood. But this next slide, you can imagine fitting in just about any neighborhood. And so this is what Complete Communities allows. It's really targeting dense development on typical residential parcels. And as the code's written, it has to be multifamily. But as you'll see in the next slide, that's a lot of San Diego. It's multifamily and it's near transit. But everything in color is a Complete Communities parcel. And so, and all of them except for the yellow ones, you could build the building in the previous slide. So as you can imagine, it doesn't take that much to do it. Your typical 50-foot wide by 120 or 140 lot that we have all over San Diego, you can now build that 32-unit building under Complete Communities. And so you're going to see these buildings popping up all over the place. I think, where we used to see 2- and 3-story garden apartments, we're now going to start seeing these 7-story, very, very dense apartment projects going up.
And for context, the colors that you're seeing is different tiers that are associated with the floor to air ratio. So basically, if you had 6,000 FAR that you could build on, well, in this case, these tiers represent multipliers. So if your lot was only zoned for 10,000, if it's in one of these tiers, depending on which one, it could be a multitude of 2.5 to upwards of 8 times.
Yep, that's exactly right. And all of the green you see around, North Park and Logan Heights and Sherman Heights, Middletown, that's all FAR 6.5. So if you've got a typical 6,000 square foot lot, you can build close to 40,000 square feet of units there. That's a lot of units. And even we consider 500 square feet large nowadays. And that's 80 units at that size. So, you're looking at a lot of density. And so as you can imagine, that's really kind of doing crazy things to land values in these areas.
One thing I wanted to point out, and Steve and I just went through this with a developer purchase, is that yes, you can build X amount of square footage, yet what you will build or what's realistic or logical may be a different conversation. So we don't want people to have this image that we're going to have 12-story buildings next to single family homes. That's probably not going to be the case, but obviously it expands the footprint of what you can do in a much more dramatic manner than any of these other conversations with ADUs, SB 9, 10, etc. And then also, Bob, it looks like you had a question. Are they making other considerations for the effects of densifying? For example, parking, infrastructure, and great question, Bob. Steve and I were talking about this yesterday. It's our understanding of, let's say, parking, right, is who is going to rent these units, or how is that going to work with people parking on the street? And so far, I mean, we're just at that point where some of these projects are getting completed and starting to get rented out. And it's impressive to see that there's a lot more people than we think that do not own cars anymore or never have. So there's these communities. Steve, we talked about one. There was 90 units in the community, and 40 units rather, didn't even own a car. And so they ended up actually having extra parking spaces available. So it's a really interesting time period right now. A lot of dynamics going on, a lot of changes, and a lot of a lot of what we believe to be the traditional way. Some of those things are really starting to give way to new ways of thinking and new ways of development and new ways of living. So, Steve, I'll kick it back to you, but I just really, it's something I'm passionate about, and we've talked a lot about because it's a very interesting time period with all these changes happening.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's a great question, and you kind of look into your crystal ball, and as Nick said, I think that the parking aspect in particular is not an unintended consequence. It's the whole point that people go, oh, okay, well, you're going to let people not park in this building with 80 units, and so they're going to spill out into the neighborhood, and it's going to be harder for me to park 4 doors down. And the city understands that very clearly. They want to make it harder for you to park 4 doors down. They want to make it so hard that you'll get rid of your car and take public transportation, and they can comply with their climate action plan. So they're trying to squeeze automobiles. It's not accidental. They don't want cars in San Diego.
All right, well, let's go to the advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah, so advantages of complete communities, unlimited density, effectively is, we just pointed out there are limits, but if your FAR is 6.5 or 8.5, which it is most places, you can build 12 or 14 stories before you hit your FAR, and that's not practical. So I think what we're going to see, there's a practical threshold at about 7 stories and about 75 to 85 feet. So that's what we're going to see all these buildings built at. Unlimited height, again, it doesn't matter because it's not practical, but it's there. No parking is required in any of these projects. They waive development impact fees for small units, and you get 2 development incentives, which allow you to relief from the zoning ordinances that may negatively impact your project. So oftentimes you can say, okay, well, I don't want to comply with setbacks, and so you can build right to the property line when otherwise you'd have a 4 or 5 foot setback, for example. And then the really big one is that you don't need to go through a discretionary permitting process for any of these projects, even if your local community plan requires it. So you can get it by right development just as if you were building an ADU in your backyard. It's the same process, even for these 100 unit buildings. So it really, really streamlines it for developers and makes it cheaper. And the cumulative impact of all these things is that it used to be that if you were going to do a development, you had to do it as big and as luxury as you could to make a profit because you were always density limited. And the city has really inverted the incentive structure. And so now all the money is in very small units. And so I think we're going to start to see far more of these units. I mean, I think there's not going to be too many units built over 500 square feet in the near future. And we're seeing them down, commonly now under 300 square feet.
Real quick, just going back to the map here, I recognize I had a couple questions. Jay asked, how do they come up with these colored areas? So Jay, it's predominantly based on, and correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but the access to mass transit. And so that way, if you're, as you'll see, like in downtown or in East Village area, that's one of the highest FAR ratios because you have a walkable neighborhood where you can walk to shopping, transportation, and all those needs that would mean it's more appropriate for that location.
Yep, that's exactly right. And then the other, it's the intersection of 2 requirements. One is that mass transit piece that Nick just mentioned, and then the other is that there's a minimum housing density. So in San Diego, that equates to RM 1-2 or above. So basically any multifamily zone as long as it's not RM11. But there's, 16 other multifamily zones that it is allowable in. So it's a lot of the multifamily parcels in San Diego.
Okay, awesome. All right, we'll get to the disadvantages.
Yeah, so there are a few. So you do have to provide affordable housing, and you have to replace any affordable units lost. And then you can either provide a public amenity, which they imagine being a nice pedestrian plaza in front of the building, which is more appropriate for downtown and perhaps Hillcrest. But in lieu of that, you can just pay a lump sum fee based on the area of your lot. And then also for disadvantages, you still have to go through the normal historical and environmental review process. So if you have a historical building or environmentally sensitive lands, you may be limited in what you can do. And then here's an example. I know a lot of you are not developers, and so you might be wondering how any of this is relevant to you. But the owner of Miller's Market was not a developer either. He owned a grocery store that, was a business worth more than $1 million, but, somewhat modest business nonetheless. But somebody understood that once Complete Communities was passed, the value of the dirt was a lot more than the value of the market. And the land under Miller's Market recently sold for $11.5 million, and that's at 30th and C in Golden Hill. So this ordinance has really done crazy things to land values. So if you are in a Complete Communities zone and own land, and you want to develop it, great. You have the opportunity to do that. But if you are not a developer and just, you're just a typical investor, what you might do is understand the value of the land and then, demonstrate that to the market and cash out by selling the property to somebody that will build the highest and best use there. Okay, and then resources. One of the perks of attending these webinars is we have goodies for you. It's virtual, so they're virtual goodies. But we have marked up ordinances. This is a page from our marked up Complete Communities code. So we highlight key things and kind of explain interpretations and just kind of make it a little easier than the legalese in the municipal code. And so we have these for Complete Communities, and then we have the ADU ordinance marked up for single family and marked up for multifamily. So Nick has access to those, and I do too. So if you want to contact either of us, we can provide you with those copies. Yep, here's a list of all of our resources, and I think that's what I had to cover.
Yeah, I want to make sure, first and foremost, thank you, Steve. I trust that everyone got some value and ahas out of this, and I wanted to open it up again to anyone on the call today. If there's a specific question about anything that we covered, or we've got time, we could even open it up to a specific ADU or project. So I'll give everyone a few minutes to let me know if there's anything that is on their mind. And we appreciate these conversations because this is really giving you a sense of the application of things, not just how it's spelled out. And so if your property is within one of these areas, if you're talking about or want to know what the options are for ADUs, Steve's available to really go through that and help qualify whether or not it makes sense or something you can move forward to actually add ADU or look to what you can do to create more income from construction on your lot or your property. So outside of that, go ahead.
Hi, this is Cindy, and I do have a property in the Marina area that looks like it's orange, which I'm not sure exactly what that means in detail. And
Okay.
It is a It is a double lot, and I did build an ADU under 500 square feet in there about 2 years ago as they were changing and prices seemed to be reasonable. However, what I'm finding is that because of the overall situation, it seems like it's easier to go ahead and rent that out. I don't know if this was a COVID thing over the last couple of years, to rent it out for the 30 days and type of situation, as opposed to renting it out for the long term. Now I'm looking at what these new ordinances and stuff are, and because it is a smaller unit and I do have a double lot, I'm wondering if it makes sense for me to add another unit, or is there a way of looking at ADUs on a second story, for example, as opposed to just adding it into the middle of this large double lot?
Yeah, great question. I think in general, it's probably going to be difficult to add a second story unless the original ADU was designed for you to be able to add a second story, just because of engineering requirements. In our seismic zone, it can often be cost prohibitive. So it might be more cost effective for you to add, and whether you added a single story or two story, that certainly would be a possibility.
Okay. And then one other question about the public spaces that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Is that I have a fairly large lot, and I do have a pool. So what is considered that public space? Is that in the vicinity or on the lot itself?
Well, it would be on the lot itself, yeah.
Okay.
And then, but that in this complete communities ordinances, the public space I was talking about would be if you opt for that package of ordinances. So what the city's doing is they're trying to lure developers into doing these dense developments on their property. And so they say, okay, it's a devil's bargain. You can build a whole bunch of units, but you got to pay us back by providing affordable housing and public amenity. And so the city thinks that's a pretty good deal. But if you don't opt into the complete communities package in the first place, you can still take advantage of ADUs and that sort of thing, and then you have no requirement to provide, at this point, any public amenity. And they were talking about adding street trees back in, but as near as I can see, they didn't actually adopt that into law.
Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for the question, Cindy. The other
Sure.
thing I wanted to just quickly share with everyone was one of the first complete communities examples to be brought to market. So this is in downtown San Diego. And this is, I believe, 46 units. Some of you may have already seen this, actually, because they actually built it around this historical building that they had to take apart and then reassemble.
Wow.
So they've created an amenity within that historical. They're going to create some retail space. But this building was fit on a 4,600 square foot lot. And they offered studios from 200 square feet to approximately 300 square feet, 0 parking, and they are 100% rented out. And these units are renting from anywhere from $1,600 to $1,900 a month. So just an example of, we think of 200 square feet or 300 square feet, and it seems like it would be difficult to have a functional living space that, has longevity to it. But when, design is made, I mean, they built in the Murphy beds, they built in things into the units to make it more functional and make it, a higher likelihood you're going to have more people interested in it based on the way they've laid it out. So just wanted to share an example of it because, again, complete communities and the actual finished product, we're just at the beginning of this. We don't, right? And this is going to be a very interesting time period because this is going to help answer questions about how much do people care about parking? How much do people care about that it's a studio with only 200 square feet? We don't have data. We don't really know. So as these projects hit the market, it's really going to give us a better renewed sense of what is the market like right now? What are consumers willing, able, and want to move into? And I think it's going to probably help us understand there's, a lot of biases that we carry with us that probably aren't going to serve us as well anymore in this new era of construction and density and right, all the new overlays that we're seeing. So
Yeah.
I have one more question related to that point, and that is because I do this, I have property in Waikiki as well as there in San Diego.
Nice.
And I do these turnovers, and I personally can't stand the long-term rental for one main reason. I'm sick of people bringing all their crap into my place and not taking it out and then making me the dumpster. So the short-term rentals have been attracted to me because I've got it furnished. The stuff's in there and that's it. You don't bring anything in but your clothes. And I'm happy for that. That being said, it would be interesting to me to see from a furnished versus unfurnished standpoint what these ADUs, especially in these tighter communities, are looking like. Are people, along with not bringing a car, are they also more inclined to go to places that are already furnished as opposed to bringing in all their junk into a small place where it may not fit anyway? Just curious.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have our hands and our finger on a lot of these projects. So thank you for that, Cindy. And I agree. It would make a lot of sense that at some point, probably later this year, really based on how many comes to market, but we'll be able to put a call together and really start to go through some of these numbers and see what's, what's selling, what's renting, how big are the units, what's the dollar, per foot, what are the amenities, just things like that, so we can get a better sense of how these new communities are, having people live and what that looks like and what it means for us for longer term. So thank you everyone for the call and for jumping on. I hope you guys all got value out of this, and have an awesome rest of the week. Next month, we'll be doing a case study on a 1031 exchange client who leveraged one condo into 3 houses for better returns. So if that's a value, hop on. And outside of that, have an awesome rest of the week. And thanks for joining us.